So for those who don't know me, my name is Nick Biddle. I'm the head of the School of Politics and International Relations in the Research School of Social Sciences. And I'm just getting proceedings started, and I'm going to hand over to the expert speakers. But before we do that, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us in the room, and recognise the ongoing ownership and contribution which the Indigenous population makes to Australia and this university. So we're all here to hear about the UK election, which I think is about to start voting in a matter of minutes, or at least hours. Right. And so we've got 4 panellists to talk through both some data, some history, and some thoughts and reflections, not only on the election to come, but also the last decade or so of UK politics. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Charles Miller, who's going to start off with the event.
Introducing, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for introducing us, Nick. And yes, well, we should have a very interesting event this evening. So I'm going to start off by talking about a little bit of the overview of what's been happening in the UK, the economic data, where it sits, where it fits internationally, and also some of the challenges that will be lying ahead economically for the UK and strategically also for the UK after the election. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Politics and International Relations. I've been here now for 10 years, got a PhD from... Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Got my PhD from Duke University in 2013, and have been there. I've been here in Australia at the ANU ever since. And I will pass over to Ian to introduce himself.
Ian McAllister, and I've done in past years work on British electoral behaviour, also on Northern Ireland politics, and also on Scotland politics.
Oh.
I'm Helen Sullivan. I'm the outsider on this panel for any number of reasons. I currently am the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, and in my spare time I'm a Professor of Public Policy.
Hi, I'm Patrick Leslie. I'm a Research Fellow here at the School of Politics and International Relations. I did my PhD on British politics, and I now focus mostly on Australian politics.
Okay, folks, so let's kick off with a little video.
Fellow here at the School of Politics and International Relations. I did my PhD on British politics, and I now focus mostly on Australian politics.
Okay, folks, so let's kick off with a little video.
Fellow here at the School of Politics and International Relations. I did my PhD on British politics, and I now focus mostly on Australian politics.
Okay, folks, so let's kick off with a little video.
Fellow here at the School of Politics and International Relations.
So this is a popular British morning television show called This Morning, and it's their Daily Spin to Win segment. This aired I think it was last September, I believe, and it was widely seen as being symptomatic of the cost of living crisis in the UK. And in fact, it was widely condemned by a number of different figures throughout the media and politics and so on, condemned as being dystopian, seen as the symbol of an economy that was broken and so on. And so I think it's a really, really good kind of entry into this election in the UK, because I think it kind of sums up certainly how a lot of British people perceive the British economy to be just now. But what I want to do in trying to kind of contextualise how things are going with the UK just now is really to just take a look at some of the kind of top line data. Yeah, so what I'm going to be doing here is to basically give an idea of what the UK's economic performance has actually been like, how the UK's economic performance has actually fed into British politics, and how British politics has fed back in to the UK's economic performance, and then I'll round off with a little bit of a segment about one of the major challenges that's going to face Keir Starmer and that's going to make the economic situation rather difficult. So, first of all, as we can see here, so this is inflation. As you can see, the inflation...
Charlie, I'll just...
Yeah, if you could do that, yeah. As you can see, I mean, the inflation rate over the last few years in the UK has shot up. So especially from 2020 onwards. But the fact is that it's shot up in all of the major developed countries as well. So what we can see up here, we have the United States, Germany, Italy and France, which are the countries to which the UK is generally compared. And their inflation rates have gone up almost exactly in tandem with that of the United Kingdom. But the way that voters perceive it in each one of these countries is that the origins of this inflation are not necessarily global, but rather the fault of the individual policymakers. So the policymakers have not really been given a pass for the fact that it's happening in other countries as well. And it's the same for the United Kingdom as it is for the United States, as it is for France, as it is for other countries. And if you want to know why it is that incumbents of whichever political stripe are really struggling electorally this year, whether it be in the United States, the UK or elsewhere, I think really this chart here showing the inflation rate is really the one that I would look to for an explanation. And I think that means that basically once Keir Starmer gets in, that's then going to become his problem. And if he's not going to be able to deal with inflation, then he could face further problems further down the line. So Pat, if we can scroll a little bit further down. All right, another kind of stylized fact that has often been brought forward in the last few years to give the impression rather that the UK is really on the uppers economically is something that's called the Mississippi problem. So a number of economists have had a look at what you would do if you were to consider each individual US state as an independent country and calculate what its GDP per capita would be and how it would compare to the UK. And generally what they're finding is that the United Kingdom, the national average GDP would put it really, really low down the income distribution relative to the United States. So according to some economists, the UK, if it were a state of the Union, would be poorer than every other state besides Mississippi. Depends how you calculate it. Some might say maybe we're just about clearing Alabama or Virginia, or West Virginia, I beg your pardon. But it does really depend on whether you include or exclude London. So what we've got here is an analysis from the Financial Times, which basically looks at the UK with and without London and how it compares not just to the United States but also to Germany and the Netherlands, which are really comparable European countries. So as we see up here, the little blue line is the national average between Manchester and the southeast, and that is including London. So if you include London, Britain's national average GDP is approximately equivalent to Alabama. If you take London out, just below the 40 line there, it's poorer than every single state bar Mississippi, or it's just around about on the same level as Mississippi. If you were to take the richest region out of Germany, it pretty much doesn't move anything at all. If you take the richest region out of the Netherlands, it doesn't move things very much. So what this shows is that the UK in general is doing really badly compared to the United States in terms of GDP per capita, and it's doing even worse if you take out London. So Pat, can we lower it down a little bit? However, I think there is some context that needs to be borne in mind here. This is what happens if you do the same exercise comparing states of the United States and member states of the EU. So as you can see, here's Mississippi right down there, and that's the last little orange line. And then there's Czechia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Estonia, Spain, Poland, Portugal, Hungary, and so on. Even Germany is ranking below Oklahoma, Missouri, Tennessee, Indiana, Utah, various other states that we don't generally tend to think of as being sort of hotbeds of economic activity. So Pat, if we can scroll down just a little bit further. Yeah. So this is what basically what this story then is all about. It's not necessarily that the UK economy has done terribly badly since 2010 relative to Europe. It's that the United Kingdom and Europe both together have done really, really badly relative to the United States. So if we look here, there's 2010. That's when the Conservatives took power. And then we see, so the UK is the dashed kind of purple lilac line, and the United States is the red line, and Germany is the green one. Now, as you can see, there was this one kind of shining moment just before the global financial crisis, when on a per capita basis, the UK was actually richer than the United States and Germany, which is a really quite remarkable testament how good Britain's economic performance had been in the 90s and 2000s. I mean, this is, I think, probably something that had not happened since the Victorian era. But then, after the global financial crisis, what you see is a divergence. So the UK gets hit really badly. Europe keeps on staggering along without too much of a difference, but the United States takes off. And that's why if you compare the UK to the American states, or the American states to member states of the EU, generally the United States comes out an awful lot better. So it's not necessarily like the UK's economic performance makes a basket case or that it's done terribly badly. It's just done terribly badly relative to the United States. And that's mostly because the United States has done really, really well. So Pat, can we bring it down a little bit? So this is, I mean, just to kind of show the same thing. If you look at the European Union and per capita current GDP, the UK and the European Union track each other more or less perfectly over the last few decades, and the UK is still that little bit richer per capita than the European Union is, obviously. That includes the Southern European and the Eastern European countries and so on. But nonetheless, I mean, it's a bit of a corrective to this idea that you often get that the UK is now a poor country or there's a basket case and so on and so forth. So let's now look again at how the UK is doing in terms of some of the things that we would expect Brexit to have affected. So if you look at merchandise exports, for instance, in current dollars, so this is current billions of dollars, you basically see, I mean, obviously Germany is dominant in Europe. The UK is not doing terribly great, but it's tracking broadly with the trends in France and the trends in Germany. So as I'll come to in a little minute or so, it's not that Brexit hasn't damaged the UK economy, but there's so many other things going on, and there has been so little time since Brexit actually occurred that you really have to squint to see it. Okay, so let's Pat, let's go a little bit further down. So again, when we look at unemployment, here, I mean, you see, you know, there's an enormous jump in certain countries, the global financial crisis, and again with COVID. But the UK again is not notably much worse than any other countries. It's better by far than certain other countries, especially in continental Europe. If we go down a little bit further, Pat, trade as a percentage of GDP. So again, the United Kingdom's performance almost perfectly tracks France and Italy. It's not as strong as Germany, much less autarkic than the United States. But again, if you're going to see a real effect of Brexit on the UK or of Conservative rule in the UK, you really, again, you have to squint. So let's go down. Let's, for the sake of speed, we'll go past the top 10 income share, which we can have a look at. But let's then go back and see, okay, what were the Conservatives faced with when they entered power in 2010? So the global financial crisis hit towards the end of 2008. And the initial policy that the Labour government under Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling undertook was essentially quite similar to what the Americans did. It was essentially to try and stimulate the economy, bail out the banks, and try and get the economy moving again. Now, when the Conservative Party under David Cameron and George Osborne, the then Chancellor, came in, their argument was that this is wrong. And that what we need to do is we need to basically reduce Britain's government deficit, reduce Britain's government debt, and bring these under control in order to restore confidence in the British economy. Now, just a small kind of vignette that you often get in these kind of panels. One of my dissertation panel members was a guy named David Soskas, Professor of Political Economy at Oxford University. He said to me just before the 2010 election, we were talking about austerity and about what the Conservatives were going to do. And I said, okay, do you think it's justified? Do you think that they're going to do this? And he said, well, no, because first of all, the British economy and the British government debt is denominated in pounds sterling. So Britain cannot actually go bankrupt. The biggest danger from Britain continuing to hemorrhage debt is inflation, but that's not the main concern right now. And so therefore, he believed, or he said to me, that austerity was basically a political strategy on the part of the Conservative Party, which was designed to differentiate themselves from the Labour Party, and that most likely when they got into office, they'd drop it. So an interesting little kind of historical vignette, because that is of course not what they did. So let's move down a little bit further, okay? So one of the reasons why he said this is because at the time of the global financial crisis, worldwide interest rates were at a historic low. So this is the trend of interest rates from 2000 all the way up to the 2000, all the way up to the present day. And again, you can see from a high in the early 2000s, they just kept coming down and down and down. And this is interest rates, by the way, on government debt. And if you were to extend this series out back to the 1960s, you would see it had come down even further before then. And the reason why that was because you had this glut of savings from East Asia, and especially China, going into global capital markets and reducing the cost of capital for governments to borrow. So what you then have is a situation in which the UK could have chosen to go down the road of fiscal stimulus. So it could have basically continued the policy that Brown and Darling had initiated of trying to stimulate their way out of the economy, and most likely because of the low cost of capital at that time, they would have been able to do it. So Pat, if you can scroll down a little bit further. And this is the same thing with short-term interest rates. So again, they actually dropped for many countries following the global financial crisis because government debt was seen as being a much safer investment than corporate stocks and entities and so on and so forth. So then what you've got is an austerity policy which really, to be honest, many people would now say, with reason, was not necessary. And the question then is, okay, well, how did that feed back into the politics of, how did that feed back into British politics? There's a very interesting paper which I'm going to show you down to the table from the side. So Pat, if you can scroll down here a little bit. So this is an analysis which was done by an economist at Warwick University of the effects of austerity on Brexit. Now, it's really, really difficult to pinpoint why Brexit occurred because it's basically one single vote. And so there's no way in which you can use changes in certain variables over time to identify whether X or Y or Z had a causal effect on it. Okay, so his solution for dealing with that problem was to basically look at the rise in the votes for the UK Independence Party, which is the main party which was campaigning for Brexit prior to the actual occurrence of Brexit, and look at the change in their vote over time as being essentially a proxy for the rise of Brexit sentiment, and then correlating this with the exposure of various parts of the UK to the steepest cuts in Brexit. And so what he looked at was, if you go from 2000 to 2010 when the Conservatives were in, there's very little relationship between various measures of austerity, whether it's austerity overall, the bedroom tax, the disability living allowance, or council tax. There's very little relationship between these two, between the prevalence of people claiming these benefits at local authority level prior to 2010. But after 2010, when Brexit hit, you can see the relationship shoots up. So basically, the relationship changes from one that was non-existent to one that was actually there. And the argument is that essentially austerity led to this level of hardship in many local authorities across the UK. People look for a scapegoat, and the natural outlet for them was to vote for the United Kingdom Independence Party, and in turn also then for Brexit. So if we can, Pat, if we can just go down a little bit further. So keep going, past that. All right, and then what happened, what effect did Brexit have on the British economy overall? So like I said, you really have to squint earlier on in order to see what was happening between Brexit and the British economy. But there are methods that economists use to try and figure out what the effect of a particular policy intervention in a particular country is. It's a method called synthetic control. And the idea is that you take, if you like, a basket of countries that are similar to the UK, you then create a weighted average of this basket of countries, which is kind of like the synthetic or the doppelganger UK. It's weighted in such a way that the more similar a particular country is to Britain, the higher the weight there is for their average. And then you basically validate this by seeing, okay, does this weighted average, does this doppelganger UK behave in the same way that the actual UK did prior to Brexit? Okay, and this is what they did. And then the question is, okay, then once Brexit happens, do you see a divergence between the UK and this weighted average of similar countries that did not do Brexit, right? And this is the conclusion. So we see here, the UK is the line in blue, okay, and the red line, that is the doppelganger UK, so the weighted average, the basket of other countries. And what you can see is there starts to be a slight divergence after the referendum, when Britain actually chose to leave the EU. Then the British government actually left the EU in 2020, and when it did, there then comes to be a really rather large shortfall in overall output. So 33 billion pounds is the estimate. Okay, so Pat, if we can scroll down just a little bit further. So further down from there. All right, so now, just to kind of get, and I'll try and wrap this up really quickly so we can get on to discussing a little bit more about the politics of austerity. But in terms of the sort of future financial position of the UK, I've already spoken about the effects of inflation and how damaging this has been for the Conservative Party. And that's one thing that Starmer is going to have to get control of. But the other problem, however, is the geopolitical situation. So here, what I'm showing is basically, first of all, the military expenditure in current dollars of, on the one hand, the Russian Federation, and on the other, the UK and the European Union. Now, it looks all right. So, you know, if you include the entire European Union and the United Kingdom, it seems like we're outspending the Russians by quite a lot. But the problem is that all of this European military capability here is spread out along all of the different members of the European Union. So it's not being used with maximal efficiency. Whereas the Russian effort is directed by one single government towards one single aim. And that's what makes it very difficult. I haven't included the United States here because, to be honest, it looks very much like Donald Trump is going to win the US election. And if I was a prudent British defence planner, I wouldn't count on the United States being there in the event of there being a crisis in Eastern Europe. We would have to be reliant on European and British resources for defending Eastern Europe against Russia. And although it looks reassuring from that point of view, you have to remember that the spending is dispersed across a number of different European countries, whereas the Russian spending is concentrated under one sole guidance. And the same is also true if you look at military personnel. So Pat, if you can just scroll down a little bit. So we've got here again, now the gap is much smaller when you look at overall personnel. Russia has just over 1 million military service personnel, and the European Union minus Britain has about 1.8, but again, remember that these are people who are dispersed among numerous different national militaries. The biggest single EU member state military is, as I understand, the French military, which is just over 100,000 people. Okay, so imagine that this kind of strength, if you like, for Russia is concentrated, and for the European Union it's dispersed. And so what the bottom line or the takeaway is from this for me is that while Starmer is going to have to get control of inflation, Britain will also have to start rebuilding its military strength, because it is unlikely to be able to rely on the United States. And although the European position relative to the Russians looks pretty strong, in reality it's dispersed among so many different sort of heterogeneous countries that it actually is significantly less effective than it looks like on paper. Okay, folks, so that's me. That's the kind of the bottom line, sort of financial, economic, strategic situation. So I'd now like to hand over to Helen.
What I want to talk about really is just three things. And some of this overlaps a little bit with what Charlie's been saying, so I'll try not to dwell on that. But I think it's really clear that when we talk about austerity was a political rather than an economic decision made by the Conservative-led coalition in 2010. And to my mind, given the work that I've done, the consequences of that choice are still being felt today, and indeed will permeate into whatever it is that Keir Starmer is or isn't able to do when he becomes Prime Minister. Economically, politically, socially, culturally, or obviously exacerbated by the impact of COVID and the slow recovery from COVID. And I also think that what austerity did was to contribute to a real souring of the of British politics and polarisation in British politics. One of the things that, graphs that talk about GDP and per capita and all of that disguise is that, of course, these things are not distributed equally. And one of the things that has happened in the UK has been both a structural decline in public services, almost total collapse of meaningful local government, but also that the impacts of those things have been felt disproportionately in poorer communities. And so I think from my point of view, austerity, while it may have started in 2010, originally the politics of austerity was very much David Cameron, who was then, the opposition leader, talking about austerity really as a form of prudence. That this was in contrast to what Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling were purported to be doing, which, as Charlie's also indicated, has proved to perhaps have been a more prudent, ironically enough, strategy for saving the UK. Cameron's attack on the Labour government was that essentially they were being profligate, they were making the wrong economic decisions, and that the prudent and responsible thing to do was to enter into a programme of austerity. Now, what did that mean? What was austerity? And I think there's a couple of things that I'd want to point to here. Firstly, that austerity, yes, was something that was claimed, if you like, by the coalition in 2010. The first phase of which ran, depending on where you stand, either to 2015 or to 2019. Then we had a brief interruption where all normal rules were suspended for a couple of years in COVID, and everybody turned into Keynesians. But then since 2021 and the cost of living crisis, I think it's fair to say that austerity is now rather more of a reality in the UK than maybe the formal labels might suggest. I mean, Liz Truss was probably the one Prime Minister who, within her very short reign, managed to talk about austerity, but the difference between labelling something and its actual reality, I think, is something that you can certainly see in particular parts of the UK. And importantly, and in case I forget to say this, one of the places where you see all of this being played out that is not being covered by anybody on this panel is Wales. Wales is often the bit of the UK that gets forgotten about because it doesn't have, its own currency like Scotland. It doesn't have a history of absolutely dreadful violence like Northern Ireland, and it's not the engine of economic progress like London and the South East. It's just Wales. Now, I happen to feel this particularly strongly because I am Welsh. But I think it is one of the great mistakes that we make when we talk about politics and the UK, is that we sometimes will focus, as Ian will be, on Scotland and Northern Ireland, but invariably we assume, as one person did say to me when I first arrived in Australia, oh, Wales, what part of England is that? Anyway, getting back to the politics of austerity, George Osborne as Chancellor made a deliberate decision. Some of you will remember the very unfortunate note that was produced by Liam Byrne about the outgoing Secretary of the Treasury saying there's no money left, which is pretty much what everybody says when they leave government, but of course it was used and continues to be used against him. And Osborne certainly took that up. And his preference was to do two things. One, to eliminate the structural current budget deficit within 5 years, and two, to reduce the percentage of national debt as a percentage of GDP. Now those are pretty ambitious things to want to do, and also to want to do them so quickly. What that means, if you're not going to go down the line of trying to stimulate the economy, what it means is you have to take a great big axe to public services, and that is what happened. And so in that period from 2010, with the support of their coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats, who of course never recovered from being in partnership with the Conservatives and were almost completely wiped out in the 2015 election, we ended up with was huge cuts in public services, the freezing of public sector wages, all public sector wages for 2 years, the revising and reducing of the social safety net, particularly in benefits, both in terms of who was entitled to what benefit, but also the level of benefit, and tax cuts. Of course, tax cuts for the 20% of people who were going to always vote Conservative, or the Conservatives wanted to kind of keep on side to vote Conservative. So while Osborne's phrase of "we're all in this together" was something that was trumpeted around the policy debates at the time, there was never any question that we were all in it together. Some of us were in it much more than others. I'm not going to go through the long and painful story of how much, when, and to what extent did any of these things have an impact. Suffice to say that they did have an extraordinary impact, to the point that public services are now almost completely crippled in the United Kingdom, and anybody who has been there recently will have experienced just how nothing works, whether it's transport, whether it's housing, whether it's the NHS, which is of course the thing that everybody talks about, but it's not just the NHS, it is almost everything. And that, I think, you can trace back to 2010 and the things that were propagated in that first period of austerity, but also alongside that in subsequent years. Now, what does this mean? Just to give you some data. Well, what does it mean that the UK Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is the body that everybody looks to for some sort of measured assessment of what's going on, they consider that UK living standards have underperformed those of both wealthy countries since Conservatives entered government in 2010. And according to OECD data, Great Britain's real pay in the United Kingdom in 2022 is at the same level as in 2007. So while some of the data that Charlie's been sharing, suggests that the UK is not an economic basket case, it's a pretty uncomfortable place to be for an awful lot of people. Income inequality and wealth inequality are striking and are growing in the United Kingdom. Often when we look at income inequality, which is bad enough, people can make an argument that it's perhaps not that bad. But if you look at wealth inequality and who owns how much of the wealth in the United Kingdom, it is astonishing how unequal and divided a society we are. And of course, those impacts are not evenly distributed. If you're in London and the South East, the world looks very different to if you're in the North East or even, heaven forbid, in Wales. Just a couple of other things. Data in terms of health and life expectancy. Life expectancy has reduced for men and for women in the United Kingdom. Some work done by the Health Foundation and Liverpool University looking at what's going to happen to 2040
shows that there will be a very small group of long-term conditions, things like chronic pain, type 2 diabetes, anxiety and depression, that are going to increase at a faster rate in the 10% most deprived areas by 2040, and there is repeated data of this kind. Child poverty, something which under the last Labour government was a priority and was something that some of you may know about Sure Start, an extraordinary programme to work with children from 0 to 4 to try, which has been demonstrated through a series of studies to have actually made a positive difference to children's thriving between the years of 0 to 4 and the consequences of that in later life. Those programs were all terminated, and now there's around about, the most recent figures suggest there are something like 4.2 million children, 4.3 rather million children in the UK. That's 30% of children in the UK are now in child poverty. So again, the UK may not be a basket case, given the data that Charlie's sharing, but it's certainly not a great place to be for lots of people. The use of food banks, things that were almost extraordinarily unknown in the United Kingdom, are now things that are regularly used by large numbers of people, including people in work. And food levels of food security. Of course, we talk about everything now in terms of security. Levels of food security are extraordinarily low, and many people are at risk of great food insecurity. And I could go on and on and on. Health, access to doctors, dental care, housing, rough sleepers, the cost of tertiary education, prisons. We have a prison system that we can't actually afford to lock anybody else up because there's no room. But the biggest area, I think, where you can see the absolute terrible impact of austerity is in local government. Now, local government in the UK, unlike in Australia, is incredibly significant and provides did provide a huge range of services. The Local Government Association estimates that since 2010 and to 2023, local government lost 60% of its funding. 60%. And at the same time, government increased its responsibilities for social care. And what that means is that by and large, what local government can now do in the UK is just about manage social care, but can't do anything else. It doesn't fund youth centres, libraries, arts, museums, roads, refuse collection, social housing. Council tax hasn't been reformed since it was introduced, and so that is, although council tax bills go up, that's not a terribly good way of collecting revenue. And what's happening is increasing numbers of local authorities are effectively bankrupt, including one I used to work for, Birmingham City Council, which is the largest local authority in Europe. So economists and political scientists and politicians can all argue and do argue about the necessity of austerity and whether it was needed and if it was needed at the rate it went. I'm rather more taken by Philip Alston's report that was carried out for the United Nations in 2018. He was the special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, and what he said, having visited the UK, he described austerity as entrenching high levels of poverty and inflicting unnecessary misery in one of the richest countries in the world.
Okay, thank you, Helen. And apologies about not including a section on Wales. I think it's mostly because Wales has not been making moves about leaving the UK.
Oh, it has.
It has now, isn't it?
You've just not been paying attention.
Right, okay. Apologies for that. We should put Wales in next time. Okay, well, yeah, so, I mean, austerity is incredibly unpopular in Scotland. No question about that. And that sort of segues nicely into Ian's talk now, where we're talking about what the goings-on have been in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Very, very sorry, not Wales. Next time we do this, we'll make sure to include this section. So Ian, would you like to?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Charlie. Well, my job is to talk about Scotland and Northern Ireland, and both of those countries have been badly affected by Brexit, but they have an underlying issue there, which is whether or not they remain in the United Kingdom. And certainly Brexit has been something that's changed public opinion to a large extent on that issue. So what I'll do is talk about each of the two countries, give a bit of an overview about patterns of devolution, where we're up to now, and then we'll look at public opinion towards the constitutional issue in both of those countries, and also the likely prediction of the makeup of MPs from those two areas. So in Scotland, there was a devolution referendum in 1997 that established the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. That was established in 1999. That has worked reasonably well over a long period. The SNP, as I'll explain a bit later, they became dominant in that from about 2011 onwards. They pushed for an independence referendum. It looked at one stage as if that might actually go through, but it didn't. It was rejected 55 to 45. Since then, what has really happened is that the SNP have pushed for what's called Devo Max, which is maximum devolution. They wanted a bigger range of powers to be devolved from the Westminster Parliament to the Parliament in Edinburgh. The composition of the Scottish Government changed over time. Initially, it was a coalition of Labour and the Lib Dems. It was led by Donald Dewar, who was really one of the fathers of devolution, a big figure in Labour politics. In 2007, the SNP managed to form a minority government under Alex Salmond, again a fairly charismatic figure within the SNP. And then in 2011, the SNP became a majority government. Alex Salmond was there at the beginning of the majority government, and then he handed over to Nicola Sturgeon in 2014. Since 2016, the SNP has been back in minority government, been dependent on support from the Greens. The SNP have had a range of problems, really starting round about 2015, 2016. There was a court case over Alex Salmond. He was accused of various sexual offences in 2018. He was acquitted 2019, and he made allegations that this was really set up by Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP. Nicola Sturgeon herself resigned 2023. She said she was burnt out by the job. She'd been doing it for almost 10 years, but it also coincided with an investigation of her husband, who was the General Secretary of the SNP, over, of all things, a camper van, and where the money for the camper van had actually come from, and the allegation was that it had come from party funds. Hamza Yousaf took over the leadership of the SNP. As I mentioned, the SNP was dependent on the Greens. He, in an instance of terrible political judgment, it looked as if the coalition was going to fall apart because the Greens were going to pull out. Well, he actually pulled a pin before the Greens actually went. They were prepared to support minority government through supply, and the very fact that he pulled the pin early meant that eventually he had to go as well. The sort of issues around the last couple of years in Scottish Government have been the decline of public services, and as Helen mentioned, that's been a factor throughout the whole of Britain, but it's probably fair to say it's gone a bit further in Scotland than in a lot of other parts of the UK. There's also been a transgender debate, and the Scottish Parliament passed legislation allowing people to change their gender identity, which contradicted the legislation that Westminster Parliament had passed. Westminster Parliament blocked the legislation by the Scottish Government under the Devolution Act, the very first time it had actually done that. In terms of public opinion towards independence, that's the tracking from John Curtis's What Scotland Thinks website. You can see that public opinion has been pretty close on that issue going right back to May 2023. The high point of support for independence was 2014, 2015 with the independence referendum, but there was also a high point after the Brexit referendum. And it's worthwhile just pointing out that in both Scotland and Northern Ireland, a majority of people wanted to remain in the United Kingdom. There wasn't a majority in favour of leaving. On the other hand, what's also fair to say is that the whole independence issue in Scotland at the moment is really a second-order issue. The economy is much more important. What we've also seen has been a decoupling of the SNP and the issue of independence. 5-10 years ago, it would be 70-80% of SNP supporters were in favour of independence and a minority of Labour supporters. These days, it's not as clear-cut in terms of party support and support for independence. And what we've seen is what some people have called a rise of utilitarian nationalism. So it's not national pride or it's not nationalism in principle. It's simply asking the question, which country can deliver better economic prosperity? If Scottish people decided it would be better to have independence and they would be more economically prosperous, I think support for independence would increase. If they decided it was better to stay in the United Kingdom to get that goal, then that's what they would probably do. That's public opinion towards the major parties from 2019 through to the present time. You can see there, oops, yep, okay, got it back. You can see pretty consistent decline in SNP support going right back. It's a secular decline, it hasn't been affected by particular events, and you can see the rise of Labour, and of course the Conservatives have never really very strong in Scotland, and they're now down to about 15% or so. Liberal Dems, they tend to pick up sometimes 1 or 2 seats in the Western Isles of Scotland, the Hebrides and so on, but they're really not a factor. There's 59 Westminster seats, now 57 out of 650. In a closely fought election at Westminster, that can actually matter because it's a large number of seats, and historically Labour has been the party which has taken the bulk of those seats. Prior to devolution, there was 72 parliamentary constituencies in Scotland, a lot more. The current makeup of Westminster seats is the SNP have 43 MPs in Westminster. It makes them the 3rd largest party. Conservatives 7, Lib Dems 4, Labour 2. And you can see the prediction from election calculus how that's going to go. The SNP is going to more than half its number of seats, down to about 15. Labour is going to increase up to about 36. And the Conservatives will probably do well if they can retain just one of those 7 seats. In Northern Ireland, the situation is a bit different, though it's still underpinned by the whole constitutional issue. No need to go back to the whole question about the conflict and so on. That was effectively solved by the 1998 Northern Ireland Agreement, sometimes called the Good Friday Agreement. That established a coalition government. It's one of the few coalition governments in the world which is effectively enforced. And if there isn't a coalition, then the government can't exist under the Good Friday legislation. And the coalition, the composition of the coalition is decided under a formula called the Hunt formula. There's been various periods when devolution has been suspended. The most extensive one was between 2002 and 2007. And what happened there was the police raided the Sinn Féin offices in the Stormont Parliament, and they made the allegation that Sinn Féin members were collecting intelligence on behalf of the IRA. The Ulster Unionists then withdrew their support for the coalition, and there was a period of 5 years when there was no devolved government. 2017, there was a period of 3 years when Parliament was suspended. That was due to a scandal over subsidies for renewables, sometimes called a cash for ash scandal, where people were effectively being paid for heating their houses. And the Sinn Féin representatives, they withdrew from the Parliament. And then there's more recently a period in 2022 up to February this year when the government didn't work. And that was caused by the Unionists withdrawing over the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that was brought in 2020 as part of the Brexit solution, but it effectively put the border down the Irish Sea between mainland Britain and Northern Ireland. And the reason for that was to try and keep Northern Ireland in the single market, but ensure that goods didn't leak in both ways between mainland Britain and Ireland. The Ulster Unionists were pretty miffed by that, and they withdrew their support. In terms of first and deputy first ministers, in the very early days, it was a combination of Ulster Unionist SDLP. And then 2007, for the first time, it was the Democratic Unionists and Sinn Féin. The first minister was Ian Paisley, firebrand religious minister, leader of the Free Presbyterian Church, and the leader of Sinn Féin, Martin McGuinness, who'd been leader of the IRA in Londonderry for a long period of time, which sounds an odd combination, but apparently, to all intents and purposes, they got on so well they became known as the Chuckle Brothers, because they were always chuckling and making jokes at each other. Since earlier this year, for the first time, there's been a Sinn Féin First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, and there's been a DUP Second Minister, and that reflects the long-term rise of Sinn Féin. The underlying problem in Northern Ireland has been the constitutional preferences that people want. That's the trend going right back to the Northern Ireland Agreement in 1998. And you can see that at the beginning of the period, the majority of people wanted to remain in the United Kingdom. Then the question became one about devolved government, and that was decreased quite consistently right through to 2022. The other thing that's important there is the most recent rise in the proportion of people who are in favour of Irish unity. Now, one of the interesting things there is under the 1998 Northern Ireland Agreement legislation, if at any time the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland thinks there's a likelihood that a border poll could succeed to unify Ireland, he's under a legislative requirement to actually bring forward legislation to have a border poll. The last border poll was in 1999. Majority of people wanted to stay within the United Kingdom, and before that there was a border poll in 1973. So if at some future time that trend continues and it looks as if maybe 40-45% of people look as if they'd be in favour of voting for Irish reunification, then it's likely that there would be a border poll. That's the trend in public opinion over the last year or so. Not as many public opinion polls in Northern Ireland as you get in other parts of the UK. Not much change over the period. Currently, the DUP of it MPs, Sinn Féin has got 7, Ulster Unionists 2, SDLP 1. The likelihood is that DUP would drop 1 seat, Sinn Féin would stay the same. The Ulster Unionists would drop 1, that would be Geoffrey Donaldson's seat. He's still an MP, but he's under allegations, historical allegations of sexual misconduct. The case hasn't come to court yet. And the SDLP may pick up 1 seat in South Belfast. Doesn't have much effect because of the number of seats on the Westminster Parliament, but it's also worth just bearing in mind that the 7 Sinn Féin MPs are actually abstentionist. As a matter of principle, they don't take up their seats in the Westminster Parliament, though they still take the government subsidy for having a certain number of MPs, and that keeps the party organisation ticking over. So I'll leave it there.
So it's my job to sort of round up and provide context for the electoral campaign itself by talking about the last 5 years or so of Conservative government. I think it's most political scientists' opinions that campaigns don't really change very much. They don't often change the outcomes of an election. They are, and really, the results are decided beforehand in the years going up to that election. If you're listening to the wonderful analysis here tonight, it's quite a surprise that the Tories are still in power. So I guess my job is to start off with talking about how it is that Boris Johnson ended up with the largest Tory majority in a very long time. I can't remember the exact precedent, but if you remember in 2010, they started off having to be in coalition. They barely got a majority in 2015. Theresa May lost that majority in 2017 and had to have a confidence and supply agreement with the DUP of Northern Ireland. Boris Johnson, widely seen by many people at the time as being feckless and fairly incompetent, managed to win rather a large majority. So how did that happen? The main idea from Boris Johnson, or maybe not from Boris Johnson, perhaps maybe more from Dominic Cummings and Michael Gove, was to combine the issue of Brexit with the issue of levelling up. So there's a tacit or maybe explicit they were tacitly admitting that the previous years of Tory rule had caused all of the problems with austerity that Helen was talking about, and that there had to be something different, a new reason for a Tory government. So that was the plan, to get Brexit done and to provide for levelling up, which basically means putting back public services to somewhat the level that they had been before. This was quite a successful strategy, as we'll see. So if we look at this graph to begin with, we start off in 2020, so the 2019 election was in the middle of winter in December 2019, so this is really from the very beginning. The blue line is the support, vote share support for the Conservatives, and the red line is the vote share support for Labour. So they start off about 25 points ahead, just as COVID hits. They're about 20 points ahead, and we end up with the situation that we're in just a few weeks ago, where Rishi Sunak felt it was the right time, the best time to call an election early while trailing somewhere between 18 and 25 points in the polls. Okay, so it's my job to sort of take you through the last 5 years and sort of show you how exactly that happened. The first big success was that Brexit did get done. So Boris Johnson used the whopping great majority to break the deadlock in Parliament that had been the real thing that had ground Theresa May into the ground. She couldn't get over an agreement of what Brexit should look like because she just didn't have the majority in the House for the only thing that seemed to matter at the time, which was getting Brexit done. So they were able to push through Brexit in a deal that many people, I think most people in the UK now think is suboptimal, but it was nevertheless done. The next thing that happened very quickly was COVID. And of course, COVID contributed massively to removing all of the kind of fiscal headroom that the government had that it was thinking about. We don't know exactly how seriously, because we'll never know, but it removed the ability of the government essentially to prosecute in any serious way that second part of the sort of the pitch to the electorate, which was levelling up. Going back to the financial crisis and the previous plans for growth that prime ministers have been able to rely on, which is to use London's centre of being the centre of the financial world, so to speak, and using all of that wealth to redistribute around the country. They don't have that anymore. London's position as financial centre is still important, but it's not as important as it once was. So you can't simply go to that strategy. So anyway, how did things get worse from that? So they've got Brexit done. That's about it. As COVID drew on, all of the things that people said about Boris Johnson before becoming Prime Minister turned out to be true, and so we had a drip of pretty serious scandals. Okay, The first major one being the Dominic Cummings scandal, driving from Westminster to his home in Durham, which is in the northeast of England, during COVID lockdown. So he absolutely wasn't able to do it. They denied that it happened at first, they left it too long, and then eventually he had to resign. This is characteristic of how the Conservative Party machine has dealt with scandal after scandal over the past few years. Another very embarrassing scandal was the health minister at the time, so important role during COVID, caught on camera kissing or having an affair with a staff member, Gina, I can't pronounce the second name, sorry, but having an affair on camera kissing during lockdown. Again, Boris Johnson accepted the apology, but eventually Matt Hancock had to go. A couple of years later, appearing on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, to just provide even more embarrassment for the government. An important thing that basically was the thing that got rid of Boris Johnson eventually, the real cause of his exit, was Partygate. So Partygate was a series of social gatherings, whether you can call them parties or not, doesn't really matter. They were social gatherings in the middle of lockdown that were held at number 10 for staffers. And a couple of birthday parties, there was or was not the presence of a birthday cake. That became part of the conversation for a while. Boris said that he hadn't attended them. If he had attended them, he didn't know that they were parties. He hadn't been told about them. He just turned up and then left as soon as he'd had a couple of drinks. Nothing more, you know, that kind of excuse. This went on and on and on, and it became increasingly difficult for him to defend these allegations. But the thing we often forget, and I had forgotten this until recently, the actual thing that did for Boris Johnson in the end was a scandal known as the Chris Pincher scandal. Chris Pincher, known by Boris as Pincher by name, Pincher by nature. It was reported that he'd said this. He, of course, denied it, but it's totally believable. It's exactly the kind of thing that Boris Johnson would say, and so whether he did or didn't say it, it soon became irrelevant. He tried to cover it up. It was found out. He tried to delay, and eventually it took the resignation of both the Chancellor of the Treasurer and the Health Secretary, one after the other, and then 57 Conservative MPs and members of the government all resigned en masse, and that was the thing that got rid of him. Next came not Theresa May, I keep getting confused about which Prime Minister. Next came Liz Truss, who obviously her very, very short term period in government basically ended in a sort of dismissal. So it's the closest that we've had in the UK to a dismissal like that in a very long time. Dismissal by whom? Possibly the Bank of England. Everyone knew at the time that Britain had spent an awful lot of money trying to cope with COVID and trying to keep the economy moving. Liz Truss's first act was actually dealing with the death of the Queen. But as soon as she'd gotten back into politics, the first thing that she did was announce enormous tax cuts, leaving a huge hole in the budget, leading to a run on UK-denominated debt, the gilt market, and it was concluded very quickly that she couldn't be allowed to stay and actually make these tax cuts happen. So we move from there to Rishi Sunak, who has brought a level of maybe technocratic, if not political, competency to the running of the Tory government. When he came in, he said that there were 5 pledges that, once we get to the end of government, you can judge Rishi Sunak by. Okay? So these 5 pledges were cut inflation. That's sort of happened. actually. That's probably a success. Grow the economy, that was the second one. Also, maybe just about get over the line with that one. There was a brief recession, but technically the economy has grown. Whether it's actually been felt by people in the electorate, that's rather a different matter. The other three pledges were outright failures, really. So the third one was to cut NHS waiting lists. They're still nowhere near down to pre-COVID levels, and going up. To reduce government debt, that hasn't happened either. And the final one was to stop the vote, so a very sort of Tony Abbott-style coalition approach. In fact, it's probably Tony Abbott's idea. Special envoy in London for a while, wasn't he? So,
yeah, he was. Brexit trade specialist.
So that is actually not as popular in the UK, it turns out, as it has been in Australia. Lots of court cases surrounding that one. Usually, the UK Supreme Court does not have much say when it comes to striking down things that the government says. You know, the Westminster Parliament is very powerful relative to the court, but it is quite good at interpreting the Westminster Parliament's own laws. And so the idea was that unwanted migrants were going to be sent off to a safe country, and this safe country was Rwanda. The Supreme Court decided that Rwanda is not, in fact, everywhere and always a safe country, and so you couldn't send them there. So the response from the government was to pass a law that said Rwanda is a safe country. So the Supreme Court had to do with that what they will. In any case, the start date for flights to Rwanda was supposed to be, I think, the 28th of July, something like that. I'm not sure why Rishi Sunak decided to call an election that was going to occur before that happened, but it might have something to do with the fact that maybe they weren't actually going to go. Okay. Other failures, as Helen has talked about, councils going bust all over the place. They're primarily responsible for looking after social care, and that's the one thing that they have to do. They can't. They can get rid of the libraries, they can leave potholes in the road, but they must provide social care. Many of them can't even provide that anymore. Child poverty at record high levels, 2 million people dependent on food banks, prisons at capacity, levelling up the gender is nowhere. So that kind of explains why the Conservatives in the position that they are in now. As for Labour, big changes on the Labour front. So the last election and the last two previous elections, Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, focused on very much a sort of left-wing traditional agenda, very popular with the left and winning and not doing too badly actually on the popular vote, but massively over-winning in areas where support for that kind of left policy is strong. So in London, over-winning those constituencies and losing all of the marginal constituencies up in the north of England and in Wales. Not able to find a coalition between the traditional Labour coalition, which is London Liberals, which Jeremy Corbyn had in spades, but not so much traditional working class areas in the economically worse off parts of the country. So Keir Starmer comes in, vows to change the Labour Party. So I won't dwell too much on exactly what Keir Starmer has done. This is sort of a long story. Maybe we can talk more about it. Maybe in relation to Israel and Gaza and so on. But in terms of policy, what Keir Starmer has done was really bring back Labour to the centre ground of British politics in general. So I'm going to take you through my very quick analysis of where those manifestos lie on certain policy issues. So I'm going to look at some of the very important policy issues for people in the country, and these are all the usual suspects. They tend not to vary too much. We can look at the economy, we can look at health. Unfortunately, because of the coding scheme that I'm using, I can't look at immigration, which is a shame, and we can't look too closely at housing, but we can look at the other major things. Okay? So in terms of the economy, so I should sort of explain how to read this graph. We've got left-wing policies are on the bottom, right-wing policies are on the top. That's not a comment on my personal preferences. We have each of the elections, 2015, 2017, 2019, 2024, and the blue squares up around the top, that's the Conservative Party, and the red circles, that is the Labour Party. We also have a number of other minor parties here, but for purposes of time, I'm just going to talk about those two majors. So Jeremy Corbyn takes over in 2015 after the last election. So Ed Miliband had run reasonably centrist on the economy. In 2017, Corbyn takes them to the left. In 2019, he takes them really, really far to the left, and that spooks people quite significantly. Keir Starmer has basically hit the centre ground, which is just a weighted average of all of the recent positions. He takes it right to the centre ground and fights the economy there. Usually, the sort of Labour line for winning centrist Labour politicians is to try to make as little space between them and the Conservatives as possible. But I think here there's a sort of a chance, since the Tories have mucked up the economy so badly, to have a little bit of daylight. But in general, this is a sort of a similar to an Albanese approach, which is small target, try to accentuate political differences where you have an advantage with the electorate, and try to reduce differences where you don't. So here's a good example of that. Labour, traditionally the party of health and social care and the NHS, big difference between Labour and the Conservatives in 2024 still, even though we've come a little bit further to the right from the Corbyn years. On the environment, this one's a little bit harder to measure because the coding scheme doesn't have a natural kind of antonym for looking after the environment. There are very few people who would sort of say, "Oh, let's just trash the environment." So, Labour here comes out reasonably right-wing and very close to the Conservatives, largely because this measure it puts care for the environment against preference for growth, and it's been a very strong growth manifesto. At least that's what they're talking about from the Labour perspective. Defence, easy to measure. And here there's absolutely no daylight at all between the Conservatives and Labour on defence. A significant weakness for the Jeremy Corbyn government was a long period of time debating, internal debates and public debates within the Labour Party about whether they would support the ongoing nuclear deterrent. Did not go down too well with the defence establishment and the public in general. Now, Keir Starmer has been very clear to be as close to the Conservatives as possible when it comes to posture on defence. And then finally, we'll talk about Brexit and the European Union manifesto positions. Interestingly enough, nothing really has changed here. What has changed, of course, is the salience of Brexit. So the party positions haven't really moved very much. But for example, I think so in the last election, compared to the current election, I think there's an 80% reduction in talking about the European Union at all across those manifestos. So that's just something that it's not a big part of this election.
What is that grey line?
Grey line?
Well, you've got a dark blue and a grey.
Is that reform?
That would be reform, yeah. So it's supposed to be sort of a tealy colour, but it doesn't come out. It's a bit wishy-washy, yeah. So that's the reform view, and they've been pretty right-wing across the board. Yeah. Okay, so that's my sort of lead up to the campaign itself. As I said, despite the fact that the Tories have sort of had a bit of a shambolic campaign, a fair few missteps, they have lost a bit of vote share, but it's not really been so much around events. The most significant movement in this campaign has been the decision of Nigel Farage to run as leader of the Reform Party. Up until that point, he'd said that he wasn't going to run. He said that he was going to help. He said that he was going to help Donald Trump with his campaign in America. He also publicly said he didn't really like the idea of spending the next 5 years in Clacton, which is the constituency that he's running for. But he is now running, and his intervention has meant that the Conservative Party, who are already really, really struggling, are now facing a split on the right. Depending on which sort of poll you look at, Reform and the Conservatives are sort of now neck and neck on the national vote, but of course the Conservatives have a better distribution that will enable them to get more seats. But it is disastrous for the Conservatives in terms of their likely projected vote share. The new-fangled multi-level regression and post-stratification models that give seat projections are saying that the Tories are now anywhere between about 50 seats and 150 seats. You need 325 for a majority, so they're way off. Okay, that's me done.
All right.
Okay, folks, well, that leaves us with a nice amount of time for questions. So let's open it up for that, and priority to the audience, but if any of the panel members wish to ask questions, please by all means jump in. So gentlemen in the Pico to the back, would you like the microphone?
I can project.
Okay, on you go.
Yeah. I wondered which policies of Corbyn were led to the non-London parts of Britain rejecting Labour, particularly the north of England. Which of the sort of the progressive or left-leaning policies of Corbyn were most distasteful to the north of England? I just think it'd be quite an interesting analogy to sort of understand that if you have a view.
Jeremy Corbyn's popularity in the north of England, I suppose it's difficult to pinpoint particular policies. There are issues, sort of cultural issues. So in general, the reason why traditional working class areas have voted for Labour in the past have been that Labour straddles a very kind of fine line between economic progressive issues and trying not to say too much about social issues that are important to people who are living in the inner cities. So traditional working class person may not have too much sympathy for trans rights and trans issues, does not care about Gaza, for example.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's a matter of emphasis, really. There was, so if we to take an example, the 2019, just prior to the 2019 elections, the 2019 Labour conference, there were the abiding image of that conference is a room full of people waving flags, but they're not waving British flags, they're waving Palestinian flags. Yeah. So it's this general sense that Corbyn is fighting a battle that's not really the battle for the British electorate so much, it's a sort of a moral war that he's fighting. And that's very, very popular within sort of the liberal, sort of well-educated circles of London, but not so much in the austerity-ridden places of Britain where people are, struggling to live.
Another question for you, Patrick, on issues. Are there the usual gender differences on issues with men being more likely to nominate the economy or economic management and women being more likely to nominate health and so on as the most important issues?
I think that's probably true, but maybe Ian, is that more your kind of?
Yeah, I've looked at the data periodically, and it's a worldwide trend you find in the advanced democracies, that women are much more likely to prioritise health, education, welfare of children, things like that. Men are much more likely to prioritise economic management, taxation, defence. So yeah, and that's been happening in Britain as well as a lot of other countries as well, here as well, of course.
So are we going to get a government which reflects the priorities of women? Ian?
Well, I'd say they'd get a government that prioritise what voters actually want, what voters vote for at the end of the day. It's probably fair to say that both major political parties in Britain and also here are very alert to the changing politics of women. So the long-term trend has been that women have become more left-wing than men. That's happened here in the United States and Britain and so on. And it's been a major change from, say, 20 or 30 years ago when women were much more centre-right in their politics. And when you get a 6 or 7 percentage point shift in a group that constitutes 51% of the population, that adds up to a lot of votes. So I think both sides of politics are pretty aware of it, and we'll try and maximise that vote.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for the great talk, by the way. It was amazing. We were just wondering, so we saw the Conservatives vote greater since the 2019 election. But was that a combination of factors, or was it austerity, Brexit, and all the scandals, or was it more so because of the scandals, for example, that we saw since 2019? What would you argue is the big factors towards the Conservatives vote greater? You might have covered that already. I'm sorry, but
No, that's so that I would say that it's that big combination of factors. But what I'd add to that is that the sort of Johnson campaign in 2019 knew that they were on somewhat thin ice. The idea, the pitch to the people from Johnson was, lend me your vote. I know we've been rubbish, right? So there was this very, very effective piece of campaigning which recreated a scene from Love Actually, where, you know, Hugh Grant is sort of apologising for all of the bad stuff that he's done. And so Boris Johnson is cast in this sort of like comedic, romantic role and saying, just give us one more chance, right? Jeremy Corbyn is terrible, you don't really like him, we're going to provide that levelling up. There's been absolutely no evidence that we've done any of that in the previous 9 years, but give us another chance. That was the sort of that was the pitch. And when it didn't happen, and when things got much worse, that's really kind of that was really the thing that really angered people. Actually, the complete lack of any progress, the insulting number of scandals, and also, yeah, to be fair, the return in the Labour Party of a sort of more centrist, seen as credible leadership. All of those things combined together. Yeah.
So my question's on reform and in the continent and obviously in the US, there's been a lot of attention on kind of right-wing populist parties, and I just wonder what people's views are on not just this election, because you'll be held accountable in about 12 hours, what you're predicting, but what people's views are on the Reform Party, the longevity, and whether Farage's prediction that he will be the opposition leader, what do you think of that prediction?
No, he won't. I mean, yeah, look, I mean, maybe I can kick off with this one. I mean, first of all, you know, Farage has been through UKIP, then the Brexit Party, now Reform. I mean, they're just vehicles in many ways for his brand of politics that he keeps cycling through. Now, I mean, I know that there's always talk, you know, when a party has a really, really serious defeat, like the Conservatives are most likely to have, that, you know, maybe this party is finished, maybe there'll be a complete change in the party system, some new party will take their place. I know lots of people have said that about Labour at points over the last 14 years. People said that about the Conservatives after 1997. People said that about the Canadian Conservatives, for example, and many other parties, and it never really works. I think there's a real kind of stickiness about parties. There's an institutional strength and memory to them that makes it difficult for them to really fully go under or be replaced by something completely new, certainly in a system like Britain. So I wouldn't really say, I don't really think that reform has got the kind of future that Nigel Farage would like it to have. But maybe Ian disagrees with me.
The interesting thing about Farage is that he effectively destroyed the Conservative Party going back to Brexit. Brexit has killed the Conservative Party. We have to go back to the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1830s to see something similar that's happened to the Conservative Party, and out of those ashes a new party was born. I would have thought almost certainly if the Conservatives get less than 100 seats, they will be gobbled up by reform one way or another. Either it will happen at the constituency level, or it will happen by Suella Braverman becoming Conservative leader, and she said there should be some sort of coalition with reform. There's experience of this in British politics before. The Labour Party, for example, in the 1980s, 1990s, militant tendency went into the various constituencies, took control, and that was only stopped by Neil Kinnock becoming leader, and it effectively ended his leadership, and then he handed it over to Tony Blair, who capitalised on that. So there's a history of this in British politics. The other interesting thing about all of this is Britain appears to be moving to the left. Everybody else in Europe appears to be moving to the right. Italy, France, Germany, and so on. So there's something interesting going on in Britain that isn't going on in a lot of these other countries. A lot of it is to do with patterns of electoral behaviour and so on, but I would have thought in terms of populism that the Conservatives are really on a hiding to nothing, that Farage and the group he represents are effectively at least part of the future for the Conservatives.
Okay. Helen, would you like to jump in on this as well?
I think I need to say that, one of the, Ian's absolutely right. Brexit did for the Conservative Party, and ironically, it was, it wasn't even an issue that was, if you think about, Pat, your list of things that people care about, leaving the EU wasn't a thing that people cared about until Cameron, decided that he would give way to the right of his party and promise a referendum. So, the whole thing was just self-inflicted. I suppose the only thing I would add is that given the current state of the membership of the Conservative Party, who have an extraordinary amount of power over who gets to be the leader, and the fact that those are mostly older people who are not being replenished in the sense of the people who are coming after them and do not appear to be as right-wing as they are, this may be a problem that solves itself in about 10 years' time.
Anything more? No? Okay, so we'll go back to gentleman in the brown peacoat.
Yeah, a question about gender split. I wondered if there was a trend in terms of the number of women in the various parties, well, particularly Labour and Conservatives and possibly Reform. How is that trending? Here we've got Labour with well over 50%. And the Libs way below 50% in terms of women. How's that trending over there?
Who would like to take this one?
Involves a prediction as well, of course.
I think if the estimates for the Labour Party sort of landslide majority are correct, it will mean record numbers of women in Parliament. So they have, the Labour Party has had a policy over the past 20 years of not gender quotas in the same way that we have party gender quotas in the same way that we have in the Australian Labour Party, which tries to commit the parliamentary party to have at least 40% women, at least 40% men, and then something in between. They don't have that, but they have instituted something called all women shortlists, which is certain constituencies that are held over often safe constituencies for all women shortlists. There's been some controversy over that, but it has really helped in improving gender balance in Parliament there. There have been some efforts in the Conservative Party to do something similar. I can't give you the exact splits, but it's certainly the case that with some differences, kind of the differences that we see in Australia are somewhat replicated in the UK.
Can I just disagree maybe a little bit
Sure,
with that?
yeah.
Because one of the extraordinary things about the Conservative Party, if you can contrast them with the Libs in Australia, is that they've done much better than Labour in the UK in terms of diversity of representation. You know, they've had 3 female prime ministers have been Conservative in the UK. You know, you may or may not like any of them, and you know, one of them didn't last particularly long, but you know, they've got much closer than Labour ever had. They have a much more diverse representation at very senior positions in terms of ethnic minorities. Now, you know, the one thing that underpins all of that, of course, is class. You know, that is a completely defining factor. And I think that's where the Labour Party in the UK have probably done, as you would expect, better. But of course, where they lost out in 2019 was when Boris Johnson was very able to portray the Labour Party as basically a party of elitists and, you know, professional politicians and people who'd never had proper jobs. And so, you know, the Labour Party's had a bit of a job in terms of class to reconnect. But I do think for whatever reason, it's a very different situation to the one that pertains in Australia. And the diversity in, oddly enough, you know, one of the positive things, well, it depends on how you look at it, I suppose, that Cameron did when he came in was he really wanted to push mobility in the Conservative Party. So really he created opportunities for much more diverse representation, which is why we've ended up with Suella Braverman. So, you know.
Be careful what you do.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on your comment there that UK politics tends to be going the opposite direction from the rest of Europe. So the rest of Europe going right, UK going left. And I wanted to draw that with your graphs at the start of the talk, which I found very interesting, that it compares the economy with the UK and the rest of Europe to be roughly the same. So it's not great, but it tracks. So that implies that the UK, the Labour winning and the Conservatives losing, they're just victims of circumstance rather than policy or scandal. That's the implication if I put those two things together, right? Like,
who wants to go first on this?
Well, the other way you could possibly interpret that would be that there's really no party in Britain, and also very few in Europe, that are in favour of the economy and private enterprise. So, for example, the Conservatives effectively have ceded responsibility for promoting a free market over state control of various things. I mean, Boris, when he was Prime Minister, never saw an infrastructure project he didn't like. Bridge between Scotland and Ireland, let's build one. Let's build a new Heathrow in the middle of the Bristol Channel. These various things. He was a big government Prime Minister, even though he was a Conservative Prime Minister. And you do see the same thing in Europe. So in France, the National Rally, in the Brothers of Italy, they're all big government. The AfD in Germany in its very early years was a free market party, but they pretty rapidly got rid of all of that and started going on about immigration and various other things. So the other way to interpret that is you do get these movements to the left, to the right, but really there's the whole issue about state control versus free economy is sort of gone by the board, actually, post-COVID.
That's, I guess, a better way of making my point. The idea that, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say on that one, this may be a minority opinion on the panel here,
but I think that you actually summed it up quite well at the end. I mean, if you want to know why Britain's going left when other countries are going right, well, Britain has a centre-right government. The United States has a centre-left president. France has a centrist president. Germany has an SPD chancellor. And the incumbents basically are being punished for the cost of living. And so the reason why Britain is going left when everyone else is going right is because Britain is the only one of these countries that currently has a centre-right government at a time of high inflation and worsened cost of living. I think we often do tend to kind of overcomplicate things, like we try and read, an awful lot. I mean, I know, the scandals are all very interesting, but I mean, I think that we often tend to read a little bit too much into a lot of them. And I think that if you just sort of look at basic economic indicators, they usually tend to predict elections pretty well. And I think that explains why you've got Britain going left when everybody else is going right, in my view. But again, this may be a minority view on the panel. Anyone else want to jump in? Yeah, question over here, yes.
So the Tories have been in for 14 years, and notwithstanding the fact, we spoke about Boris being a bit of a buffoon and various scandals, how does 14 years compare as a term to other terms of government, and is part of it just that it's time for a change move?
Okay, who would like to jump in on this one first? Ian?
Well, it's called political gravity. It's one of these things you can't do anything about, and I think I think you're quite right, there is a mood for change and people are really not listening to anything Conservatives are doing. On the other hand, it's also the case that Conservatives haven't done very much for themselves either, through Boris, through scandals, Rishi's, Gamblegate, D-Day, Rwanda, all of these various things have really just cemented the view that they've had too much time and political gravity is taking over.
Anyone else? Helen? Pat? I don't think so. Okay. Yeah. So I think I had this gentleman here and then this gentleman here. Yes? Oh, you had a question? No, you had your hand up?
I'm just...
Oh, okay. No, you, sorry, gentleman with the brown coat and the scarf.
Yes. You mentioned that correctly that the Conservative Party has done kind of a good job in promoting women to positions of power, but I also wanted to stress that it has done a good job in promoting migrants, people with a migrant background, to positions of power. Rishi Sunak is a good example of that. But in general, the UK, I think the political system in the UK has favored the incorporation of migrants to political positions. For example, you mentioned the former Scottish Prime Minister, or I think it is called the First Minister, actually. He has also I think his family is from Pakistan, his parents. And you have also I think the current mayor of London. He also has a Pakistan background.
Sadiq Khan.
So, and I wanted to know why, because probably in Australia you have even a higher proportion of migrants as a percentage of the population, and you don't get to see that same level of representation. Why do you think that could be happening?
Okay, who'd like to take this grenade?
There's a fairly simple reason, and that is political parties in Britain are more porous. It's much more easy to move in and out of the political elite. So if you've worked in the private sector, the public service, it's easier to get into a political party and stand for election. In Australia, by and large, you have to be involved in student politics, you have to go through, work for a minister, do various other things. They reward party loyalty much more in Australia than they do in any other set of political parties I've ever seen anywhere in the world. Now, the reasons for that we could debate, but a lot of it must come back to things like compulsory voting, which make people very attuned to political parties and having very frequent elections, the net effect of that is party identification is very strong, and it makes political parties highly disciplined. And we've seen that recently with the senator from Afghanistan who's today resigned from the Labour Party because she crossed the floor on an issue of confidence. Issues of confidence happen all the time in the British Parliament. People change sides even on when there's what's called a three-line whip, which is the maximum level of discipline. They don't get thrown out of the party for it. But here, one transgression against the party gets you suspended. So I think a lot of it comes down to the extent to which people can move in and out of parties here as compared to Britain.
Yes. Okay. Helen, Pat? Okay, so yes.
Thanks very much. I wanted to ask, why do you think the vote on the left of the UK has sort of really stuck behind the Labour Party? Because I think, you know, when you see, for example, shifts from the right to the left in Australia or the US, there's this real split between sort of the more progressive parts and the more moderate parts. Like in Australia, we've seen a real defection to the Greens. But in the UK, the sort of London Liberals and the working class people that you talked about before, they're very much like stuck together in this election. Just curious if you have any views on that.
Okay. Ian, maybe that would be... Yeah, there you go. Yeah. On you go.
There's a very simple answer to that, which is the voting system. You know, we have a first past the post voting system in the UK, and that means that, you know, unlike in Australia, where, yes, you have to vote, it's compulsory, but, you know, your vote can count in a range of ways. There are actually very few people's votes that count in the UK. You know, there might be a few more on this occasion, but usually there's, you know, there's identified marginal electorates, and, you know, that's where your vote counts. Everywhere else, you're just showing up for, you know, because it's part of your civic duty. And I just wanted, at the risk of getting into a conversation maybe we don't want to have, you know, this talk about, you know, why are we going to the left in the UK when everybody else is moving to the right. I think we need to be really careful. You know, what's left about the Labour Party in the UK? I mean, I think there's a real question. So, you know, your point about, you know, why do the progressives, people who maybe under Corbyn would have belonged to Momentum, the grassroots movement in the UK, which has kind of fallen away. You know, there is a huge amount of discussion about, you know, where the left will end up. And one of the concerns is that if Keir Starmer ends up with a smaller majority than everybody's expecting, then he will be held much more strongly by the left of the party than he will be if he has a big majority. And not least because there'll be so many new people. But I think we do have to be careful about when we're talking about the left, what we actually mean, because usually both in Australia and in the UK, we actually really mean, you know, it's a bit less right than than it might otherwise be.
Right. Pat, you want to?
And just to sort of add to that, it has been Keir Starmer's leadership has been very, very controversial. It's been quite a significant shift. So we saw in those graphs that big shifts on things like defence policy, on health policy, on environmental policy, going back to quite a sort of technocratic, if not Blairite, something slightly different, something quite boring and grey. It has been very controversial in the Labour Party, and one of the ways that we can see that being so controversial has been Keir Starmer's handling of the issue of Israel and Gaza. Okay, so we talked about how supportive the Jeremy Corbyn leadership was of Palestine in general, very progressive position. Keir Starmer has been accused of overkill in trying to root out all aspects of anti-Semitism, real or imagined, in the Labour Party. So there have been a few examples of Labour candidates being removed over things like liking a Jon Stewart tweet, that kind of thing. Stuff that is fairly marginal in the grand scheme of things, has been pursued fairly ruthlessly. And Keir Starmer sort of justifies it by saying, well, I have to be ruthless in rooting out anti-Semitism. And he may well be right. but many observers on the left disagree quite strongly with that, basically accusing him of conducting a sort of long-term purge of the left within the party. It's been reasonably successful so far. He hasn't had to back down on very many things, except for one notable example, which has been Diane Abbott. So Diane Abbott, the first black woman in Parliament, a real sort of progressive trailblazer, got into issues over anti-Semitism, said some fairly dodgy things, it has to be said, but apologised, begged for the whip to be given back, and was ignored quite visibly by the leadership. And eventually, during the campaign, I don't think they wanted to have to do this, but they basically tried to get her to resign. She refused to resign. Eventually, they had to back down. If, as Helen says, they don't get a big majority, I think, yeah, there will have to be some a little bit more acknowledgement that the left of the Labour Party even exists. But right now, they're pretending that it doesn't.
Okay. Can I? Oh, yes.
So since the UK uses first past the post, which causes a great level of disproportionality between the seats in the popular votes, does any major party have a plan for electoral reform for the current election system?
Okay. Helen, do you want to?
Well, I mean, I need to say no. As long as it works for them, they're not going to change it. What will really frighten them, I mean, Ian probably got a better perspective on this, but I think what will really frighten them this time is if Reform get a very big chunk of the proportion of the vote, it doesn't turn into very many seats, what that is going to do to the political conversation, because I think that will be a conversation nobody will want to have, even people who do want to, who do think we should go change our voting system. Because if changing the voting system means you let in parties like Reform, that's nothing that we've ever contemplated.
Would you like Reform becomes a leader of the official opposition?
Yeah.
Well, that's that. But then he'll probably change his mind and say that they don't want.
Yeah, there's been various efforts to try and change the electoral system over the last 20 or 30 years, and of course, with the coalition government that the Conservatives had, with the Lib Dems, the price of that was having a royal commission to look at the electoral system. They had a referendum. Now, the proposal they put forward was for the Australian system of preferential voting, which would still preserve the link between the MP and his or her electors. So it really wasn't a very radical change. But the thing I find interesting about all of this is in the other parts of the United Kingdom, there's really quite complex proportional representation systems. So in Scotland, there's a mixed system. People get 2 votes, similar systems they have in Germany and New Zealand. Northern Ireland has single transferable vote, PR. Wales, I don't know.
Well, there's a single transferable vote.
Single transferable vote as well. So there's actually significant parts of the UK that have a lot of experience with PR systems. So I would have thought potentially there could be another debate about the reform of the electoral system in the future, particularly if Reform does quite well in terms of the national vote, but gets very few seats.
Okay. Yes. So
So I've just got a question about Brexit. I think
Go
I'm
on.
the only one that's actually asked this.
Go on, yeah.
But obviously, this particular election, there's not really been much of a talk around that. What do we kind of foresee as how Keir Starmer's Labour government is actually going to kind of tackle the problem of going into the single market, or how it's going to solve that, and whether or not there's going to be much more of a conversation shifting to this after, let's say tomorrow?
Well, I think it's going to be very gradual, whatever he does. So, I mean, obviously, Keir Starmer is one of the, prior to Brexit, one of the biggest pro-Europeans in British politics. And also, obviously, public opinion has shifted. So, the voters on average now tend to think that Brexit was a mistake. But the problem for anybody who wants Britain to return to the European Union is that the Remain voters are disproportionately distributed in marginal constituencies, so they have much more power than their numbers would actually normally suggest. And what Keir Starmer, I think, wants to do with this issue is to try and defuse it as much as possible. He doesn't want to reopen it. But I mean, if I were him, I think that you are really going to have to move back towards alignment with the European Union. Not necessarily to rejoining the European Union right now, certainly not in this Parliament, or maybe even the next one, but realigning British regulations, realigning the British economy with the European Union, because for me that's a way to generate economic growth which can then pay for the domestic priorities that he's going to have. I think that he could do that without necessarily reopening the question of Brexit or paying a major economic, paying a major political price for it, but he would get an economic benefit that he could then translate into a political benefit. So who else would like to jump in on this one? Ian? No? Okay, yes.
The red wall seats that were won by Boris Johnson that had been Labour since the war, where are they going? Are they going back to Labour? Are they going to reform, or the Tories?
Pat, I think that's your...
And
Helen, yeah.
From a red wall seat. Yeah, they're going back to Labour for the most part. Why? It's not all that clear, but just for want of an alternative, they're largely projected to return to Labour. There has been go back to the sort of issue of Israel and Gaza. Some of those, well, there's a number of different kinds of red wall seats, but some of them around Greater Manchester have a significant number of Muslim voters, and Keir Starmer has, and many Labour politicians are quite worried about losing that Muslim vote in those areas. So recently we've seen the return to Parliament of George Galloway. Those of you remember sort of George Galloway during the Iraq wars and on Russia Today. It's a difficult to explain figure, but sort of quite traditional conservative values. Anyway, he's been preying on Labour's weaknesses in this particular area to win a by-election recently. But those were sort of very particular circumstances. The Labour candidate was removed by the Starmer leadership for having said something anti-Semitic, so they essentially did not contest that seat. So that kind of challenge has sort of yet to be tested fully. It's almost certain that those red wall seats are going back, and now I think the conversation has sort of turned to the blue wall, and those seats in the southeast that are under significant threat, not just from Labour, but mostly from the Liberal Democrats, who we haven't really discussed at all in this talk. But that's interesting. On some polling seat projection models, in fact, probably a majority of those models at the moment, Lib Dems are actually projected to get slightly more seats than the Tories. So something like 70 seats for the Liberal Democrats, 60 seats. That's the story anyway. And if that happens, then Ed Davey, who's been running a sort of Boris Johnson-style campaign, flinging himself off all sorts of things for sort of the attention of local media, he may well be the leader of the opposition. So I think in 5 years' time we'll be talking about it.
Leading on from that, impact of tactical voting, will it be greater than other elections?
Short answer is yes. There'll be extensive tactical voting. One of the interesting things that's happened in voting behaviour over the last 20 years is the extent to which tactical voting in a whole range of countries has increased. So we had a huge amount of tactical voting here in the teal seats, upwards of every 1 and 2 votes in the 6 teal seats that were won were tactical votes. I mean, the idea was disaffected Liberals who were voting in the two is simply not true. You only have to look at the election results to see that. It's happening very extensively at the moment in France, where the centrist and left-wing candidates are getting together to oppose RM, Rally National. In the British general election, I would have thought tactical voting will be very extensive right across the country to get the Conservative candidate out.
Okay. All right, folks. Well, that concludes the panel for this evening. I hope you all enjoyed it. And we were certainly very glad to have you here. Very much enjoyed this discussion. So have a good evening. And yeah, we'll see how the results go tomorrow.
Thank you.